Good afternoon, everybody. Thursday, 3 o'clock. We are ready to kick off another, for me, very, very fascinating and interesting episode of the Agave sessions. I have really been working to get today's guest on for a few weeks now. He's been traveling back and forth, so it's been a little bit hard for us to get synchronized, but I'm very, very excited. This is somebody who I have known of and followed for several years. It was one of the first books that I read even before I really started working with Agave spirits and was just bartending, first getting into the industry, very wet behind the ears, so to speak. And it was really one of the books that set the tone for my approach and how I see and talk about agave spirits. And that is this book here, Tequila, Natural and Cultural History. If you have not read it, I highly, highly encourage you to do so. And my guest this afternoon is one of the co-authors, a ethnobotanist, an agricultural ecologist, just a really fascinating individual, a mentor to so many of us from the spirit side of things, also from the botanical and cultural side of things. My guest this afternoon is Professor Gary Nabhan. Gary, are you there, my friend? There he is. We'll have video of him in a second. We hear the voice floating through the ether.
Start my video.
There we are. Oh, we had a flash of him. Hey, Gary, how are you doing this afternoon? How are you?
Thank you. So great to be with you, Francisco. Thanks for the invitation and for all you've taught me.
Oh, you are just being too kind this afternoon, man. It's really just an honor to have you on. I'm so glad we finally got our schedule synchronized. That's fantastic. As you probably know, I was lucky to have Ben on a couple of weeks ago from the Desert Laboratory. Gary is also joining us from Southern Arizona, although his work has taken him all over the United States and Mexico and other places. But you are joining us from your home in Patagonia. Is that correct?
That's correct. Just 18 kilometers north of the border.
That is, if anybody has not traveled to that part of Arizona, it really is kind of very much on the back roads off the highway. And it's just a really, really beautiful and I think underappreciated part of the state. So if you're ever out there, highly, highly encourage you to make it out. So Gary, you just got back from Mexico, right? Can you tell us a little bit about what it is that or where you went at least, and maybe we can talk about what you were working on a little bit later?
Sure. Well, my wife and I have a cabin on the coast of Sonora where I started to work almost 50 years ago this winter. And we're in a place where there's 4 or 5 different kinds of wild agaves, but no agriculture for 50 miles. From there, we went down to Oaxaca to look at the incredible range of innovations in the Mezcal and 100% agave distillate industries. And we'll talk about that later, but we are really interested in how every state has a different balance of innovation and traditions. So to see the northernmost state in Mexico, and then for 2 weeks after that, get down to Oaxaca, the Day of the Dead, for all the ceremonies there and all the tastings during the day was just a great combination.
That's fantastic. What was the energy? I would imagine it was very, very subdued down there. I was disheartened to not be able to travel, but in speaking with everybody that is on the Vago side of things, luckily at this point, everybody is healthy. And having some friends that run restaurants down there, definitely just kind of working to get by. But I'm hoping that the people that you were visiting were still healthy and safe and able to at least partake in their own traditions, and not having those be too inhibited by the pandemic down there.
Well, you're absolutely right that there was a lot of caution there. We only ate at outdoor rooftop restaurants. And then we were out in the fields most of the time, and they were handling it very, very well. Museums and a lot of the distilleries were closed for tastings, but there was a great opportunity to just be around the palenques and the milpas to see the whole process of taking agaves from the ground into the essence of them as a distillate.
So you mentioned that you and your wife have a house in Sonora. Is that where most of your work has been done over your career, or has it really been spread out over a large area and just kind of, is it just because Sonora is kind of close to your home in Arizona?
Well, I fell in love with Sonora 50 years ago and have had projects almost continuously there with colleagues ever since then, including with where our home is in a Surrey Indian community that still harvest wild agaves from the islands in the Gulf of California, but they don't make any mezcal, even though Apaches used to make it fairly close by. I have worked in northern Mexico more than southern Mexico, so you're much more adept at knowing the range of mezcals and sort of craftsmanship in Oaxaca and Michoacan and the other central and southern states of Mexico. So it's always a treat to go down there and start over in Mezcal 101 with a different set of traditions.
So you mentioned that the Surrey are actually harvesting agave from the islands in the Gulf. Is that what I heard correctly? And what are they using those for? If not to, are they still using it as a food source, as a textile source? What are some of the things? How are they incorporating that?
They use it ceremonially as a food source. The mezcal tatemada, or roasted agave hearts, that the word mezcal comes from, mezcali, means just roasted agave. And they continue to do that. And so the roasting pits are very much like ones you've seen before. But they don't drink distilled beverages, only seasonally fermented beverages from agave and cactus fruit like the saguaros that you grew up around. So they use it as a ceremonial fermented beverage.
And I apologize if you did mention, what type of agave is it that they're harvesting?
There's about 6 different kinds there, but they're in the desert agave group, Agave deserti and its relatives. There's also the Baccanora agave within their range, but it's back in the mountains. And so it's very similar to the ones you know in Tucson, plus several more that are what we call endemic or unique to small areas in Mexico, like Agave felgeri that only grows between their villages and Guaymas, Sonora. And that was named for one of my mentors, Richard Felger, an agave expert that just passed away 2 weeks ago, right around Day of the Dead. So we were celebrating or commemorating his life there.
Well, my thoughts to you and the Borderlands plant community, because I never had the pleasure of meeting him, but I know that the man was definitely a giant in the community in that I think you and Ben are both a part of. So definitely our thoughts go out to you guys on that for sure.
Well, and that's another thing that people may not think of Arizona as having a strength in agaves, but because of 2 mentors, Dr. Howard Scott Gentry, that wrote the Agaves of Continental North America, who I worked for 2 years, and then Dr. Felger. These were people that were really top-notch scientists, but they loved Mexican culture and community. And so they were as happy with campesinos as they were with other scientists. There was no divisions there.
So I know that we've mentioned this book a few times, but this is kind of the seminal book on agave that was written by Professor Gentry, Agave of Continental North America. This is a hard copy that I was fortunate enough to, I think, hang on to accidentally when my boss, Bobby, loaned it to me. So he might want this back now that I think of it. But I know that it is occasionally available on paperback on Amazon. So if anybody is wondering what are the good, reliable books to learn about agave plants, specifically less mezcal, tequila, spirit, distillation, etc., more about the botany. And if there is a newer, updated, better resource, Gary, hopefully you would share that with us this afternoon. But as far as I know, that is still kind of the standard for learning about agave from a scientific perspective.
Well, you hit it on the head. It's still a classic. All of science is a humbling activity because you assume that people will discover things that you didn't know about. Dr. Gentry was counted up to about 280, 290 agaves, but since he died, there's been another 30 identified, about 1.5 new species of agaves, one new agave every year and a half is discovered. And so he would be really happy that some of the names have changed on what he described, but also there's been a boom in discovery of new species, both in Arizona and Oaxaca in particular.
Just to give one example of that, can we talk a little bit about Baccanora? Because originally, historically, that had been classified as what would be as an Agave Pacifica, right? But I think it got reclassified as really just kind of more of a subset of Angustifolia. Is that correct?
That's right. And I used to drink Baccanora with Dr. Gentry as he'd brew over that dilemma, so to speak. And he would say, I identified it earlier as Agave Pacifica, sort of a unique kind of agave that was in the soils of the Sierra Madre Occidental in eastern Sonora and western Chihuahua and a little bit into Sinaloa because it had a distinctive flavor. He was really talking about describing a species on the basis of its terroir, which always fascinated me. But he said, as I've traveled more and gotten all the way down to Guatemala and seen the espadines and the other angustifolias, I think it's the most widespread and diverse species of any. So it would be like comparing, domesticated dogs to coyotes or wolves. There's just a lot more genetic variability. And for drinkers, that means a lot of variation in taste and aroma. So he finally threw in the towel and said, I can't split them all out to which ones are different. I'll just call them all one thing and let the next generation worry about that. And the people I know today have genetic tools that he didn't have, but more particularly, I think they are interested in something that we're all interested in, is if an agave has a different taste and aroma and shape, why not give it a common name that we can put with a bottle and everyone can enjoy that and celebrate it?
That for somebody who is coming through a very Western discipline in a hard science in botany, that seems to be kind of a very Zen-like approach to the idea of, well, I'm just discovering what I can and it's going to evolve after my lifetime. So I'm just going to do the best that I can in this moment.
That's right. And we have 2 agaves that are in Mezcal production, Agave Liboya, that was named for a Oaxacan indigenous term that's outside of Oaxaca City, and Agave Valenciana in Jalisco that are used in Mezcal making. So these aren't like wild agaves up on cliffs that people just couldn't reach, and now they've finally been reached by rock climbers or helicopters. These are also things in the field. So even the ones that have been used for centuries in Mezcal making are still being named as distinct kinds of agave. And I think that's really exciting for all of us.
So are these just kind of natural or maybe human influenced, but are these all just evolutions of Angustifolia and Tequilana that we're seeing just naturally diversify and evolve over time? Or is it through, and it's like some weird, cross-pollinization of something that has been cultivated with something bringing pollen in from the campo? Or, do we even really not know how these different subsets have evolved?
Well, let's break that down because you asked 3 really interesting questions, all that I saw examples of when I was in Oaxaca. So first of all, with the demand for distinctive mezcals, people are still bringing wild ones into cultivation and beginning to domesticate them, just like Tecolana and the fiber agaves like Sisal and Henneken were domesticated thousands of years ago. So that's taking wild material and bringing it into cultivation for the first time, in part because of the scarcity of some of them in the wild, but also, as one maestra mezcalera told me last week, I like to play with them. I like to see what happens when we bring them into cultivation. And that's just like the domestication of every food or beverage plant that's part of agriculture today. They're continuing that process. Then you're right about another thing, that once you bring them into cultivation, and I saw this with some cupriatas. You and I saw cupriatas in Michoacan, or it's sometimes called cenizo. It goes by a lot of different common names, but on the bottles it's still called cupriata. And it's been wild and not domesticated, but now people like Emilio in Michoacan and several people in Oaxaca have brought them into their fields, and occasionally, because they're related to other agaves that flower at the same time, the bats or the hummingbirds move pollen between them, and you get new hybrids that then occur only in those fields, and that speeds up the domestication and evolution. And then, of course, there's the hidden agaves that were used once in tequila making. Up until 1950 or so, there were 8 different agaves in tequila fields that were all mixed in bottles before the denomination of origin just said that the Tequila Azul, the Agave Tecolana variety should be the only one in what's called tequila. So those others were eliminated from tequila production, but they're now being used in artisanal mezcals. And some of them were poorly known until recent geneticists and botanists and horticulturalists said, let's not throw these away, let's work on them. And they include things like Pato de Mula that you probably heard of, and Bermejo and Seguin. And so they're back in cultivation again, but not in tequilas, in mezcals and 100% distillates.
So the ones that you just mentioned, the Bermejo, Pato de Mula, those were all ones that were used in tequila, but have now been kind of saved, or whatever verb you want to use. But now they are being reintroduced into spirits production?
That's right. You said that correctly. Some were still in the hedgerows or fence rows that got around blue tequila production in the Altos region or in the Tequila Valley, but they're getting their own distinctive plantations now that may be mixed with other species and sometimes blended into asambleas or mixtas, but people who enjoyed them said, why don't we just make a mezcal or 100% distillate out of these things now that they can't be put in a bottle labeled as tequila?
So the people that are cultivating these agaves, is this more from academic? Is it more from commercial producers planting these in their fields? Is it collaboration? Who's taking on the responsibility for resuscitating these populations?
That's a great question, and you met people like Emilio and the people in Zapotitlan del Valle and Jalisco, some of whom have 10 to 25 different agave varieties, or what they call razas criollas, that they've named and keep separate and blend as distinct varieties if they want to, or they make a varietal. And it depends on the producer, but many of them said what we know from history, that historically very few mezcal or tequila plantations were monoculture like Midwestern corn is. They were always a mix of varieties, what scientists call multi-variety mixtures in one field, and that protected them from diseases and pests. And also, if a drought hit some of them or a freeze hit others of them, they could blend the different races or varieties to their pleasure. they didn't have a decline in yield because there were different ones that had different temperature and water tolerances. And so by doing that, which was the norm until relatively recently, really, Tequila Azul and Espadín are the exceptions to this whole history of growing a mixture of agaves in fields.
I would like to learn a little bit more before we get too far down the road. I would like to well, I guess actually I do have one related question to that. A few weeks ago, I was lucky enough to have on Jorge from Hacienda, and he was talking about the term what they call land race. Would that be equivalent to what you were just mentioning about raíces criollas?
Land race is the translation of this Mexican term razas criollas, which is what they call blue corn or popcorn or whatever.
Okay, great. I just wanted to make sure I was making the right translation in my head.
That's right.
I think actually I'm glad that I got the opportunity to bring up Hacienda and Jorge, because I think that touches on one of the other really interesting projects, at least for a person who grow, coming up in the relatively unknown, kind of culinary scene of Tucson. Obviously Tucson very well known for its obviously Mexican food, but people kind of working on really new, creative, innovative cuisines, dishes, they've really taken to one of the programs that I think you were very active in, and that's the Native Seed Search, correct?
That's right. I was a founder of Native Seed Search in about 1982. I had started a seed bank about 4 years ago to help indigenous friends, Hopi and Navajo and Tohono people regain seeds that they had lost over the decades that were still available in northern Mexico or in another tribe or in a Hispanic community or even among Anglos who were friends of theirs. And we brought that all together and started Native Seed Search. That's coming up on its, what would that be, 40th anniversary. And I live right above its 60-acre farm in Patagonia. And it has about 1,200 varieties of desert adapted seeds. And ironically, for some reason, we never included the perennials, fruit trees or agaves or nopal in that mix. And that's really what I'm growing on my own 5 hectares just above the farm on the hills of Patagonia. So there's a number of us that are also saving the varieties of Spanish mission fruit trees and the cultivated agaves that are in the borderlands.
Yeah, I mean, that was really one of my first exposures to that concept of like resuscitating the mission fruit trees and stuff like that was actually a visit to when my wife and I were at the time looking for a venue. We had briefly looked at the old mission at Tumacacri, and they have kind of, a lot of information about the fruit trees that we're growing. And now obviously the mission gardens in Tucson, Arizona, right at the base of a mountain, has really taken on a life of its own and really has a really interesting program that I know they do a lot of events around the Agave Heritage Festival. Shout out to those guys. I was really just fascinated at this movement that, I think was really in the Tucson area, started by you guys at Native Seed Search. And now to hear you talking about kind of the same work being done in Mexico and just the overlap between those two programs, do you see your work with the agave and things like that, do you see that being incorporated a little bit more into Native Seed Search, or do you see it or do you see Native Seed Search kind of maintaining its autonomy, or do you, are you looking to expand that program at all?
Well, Native Seed Search has participated in the Agave Festival and sells agave plants in their gift shop, but don't include it in the seed bank. But there's 5 different seed banks in Tucson and 24 public libraries that have seeds, including some of them with agave seeds that are in the Tucson-Pima County Public Library system. So overall, there's 2,200 varieties of edible plants for foods and beverages that are available for free in Tucson and other towns in Pima County like Ajo, Arizona. And that's been a big movement for 30 years. And that was why when Jonathan Mabry and I proposed that Tucson become one of the UNESCO cities of gastronomy, we were the first one to be designated in the United States because that part of our food system is so unique. We're probably the most food diverse mid-sized city in the United States. I mean, San Francisco and San Jose and a few other places that I could name because of the population density of people from all parts of the world have wonderful gardens. But Tucson's probably the primary city that's institutionalized that into an asset where people of any income level can get free seeds and plants. And now we're trying to add a component with Ben Wilder that you had on just a couple of weeks ago of an agave and prickly pear cutting exchange. So in addition to seeds, people can get plant starts, live plants to plant out and grow just like they would any kind of transplant.
That's fantastic. I had no idea that the seed bank was that deep in Tucson. That's absolutely unbelievable to me that you guys have over 2,000 varieties of edible seeds banked away that people have public access to. That is such an unbelievable public good that you guys are providing to the community. So thank you so much for that. From my own perspective of somebody who is from there, from somebody who I think walks among a group of like-minded people in my professional work through Agave and heritage food systems, indigenous knowledge, which I would like to pick your brain about a little bit more. Because I would imagine that when you guys were building the seed bank, indigenous knowledge was something that you guys were, I'm guessing, learning quite a bit from and really relying on in starting the seed bank and growing it out.
Well, that's right. And I have to say that there's some great agave seed banks in Mexico that really respect that indigenous knowledge too. At the LAM Foundation that Graciela Angeles Carreño has in Santa Catarina de las Minas, they have a seed bank and nursery for agaves. And like I said, we're starting one here or broadening one here. Jesus Garcia, that's associated with the Desert Museum in Mission Gardens, is working with me on that with the nopales and other people with the agaves. But you're right that the traditional knowledge is what makes a seed bank just a bunch of genes that, there's thousands of them at universities and in government buildings. But the difference with the community seed banks is that the indigenous knowledge is connected to those, how to cook with the seeds or how to ferment them into beverages, which kinds of corn are good for fermented beverages like tezuino, or which kinds of prickly pear are good for the fermented beverage called colonche, which agaves are best for fiber versus pulque versus mezcal versus making cowboy ropes. So all of the traditional knowledge is key to making a seed bank work. Otherwise, it would just be about counting genes, and that's not what we're into. We're trying to get these reconnected to the communities of their origin, whether indigenous or Mexican, mestizo, whatever you want to call it. And so a big effort now is to repatriate all those seeds and agave varieties back to the communities where they first originated.
If you don't mind my asking, I'm really curious. I mean, obviously, you mentioned that you have your own home in a Surrey community. A lot of your work has been done in these borderland communities. Obviously, your work through the seed bank, as we just covered. What really sparked your passion for learning about these communities, learning about these cultures, and then also wanting to share them with the world, really, through your writing and through your work?
Well, I'll tell you a little parable. I'm Arab by descent. My grandfather was a
Lebanese, right?
orchard keeper in on the Lebanon-Syria border, and 100 years ago had to come as a refugee from there during a terrible war that killed over 500,000 people and displaced millions, just like the Syrian war is today. But he could never buy land to be a farmer in the United States, but he became a fruit peddler. And he didn't have good English, but he knew how to talk about the taste and the uses of all the fruits that he sold in his little truck that went neighborhood to neighborhood selling produce, like what you may have remembered in South Tucson when you were growing up. That there would just be peddlers, falluqueros, that would come around and sell fruit out of the back of their truck. His traditional knowledge about the desert fascinated me, even though he and I didn't live in a real desert. We lived in sand dunes. And when I grew up, I kept on thinking about that, of how rich my own family heritage of desert knowledge was. So when I moved to Arizona, I just had this inclination that I should learn how to better live in a desert, to use less water and to use crops that need less irrigation. And so I apprenticed myself to elderly indigenous farmers, asking to work with them when I was in my 20s and 30s and could work 14 hours a day in 100-degree heat. And ironically, I sort of became adopted into some of those communities who were sort of fascinated that I was of Arab descent. So it never seemed like I was trying to become an Indian wannabe or anything like that. I offered my labor and service to them in things that they needed. And I just made wonderful friends who, favor de Dios, by the grace of God, they accepted me, and I'm still very much involved with many of those people. We've just had a coalition working to stop the wall along the border and protect sacred places along the border. And it was really getting back in touch with friends, some of whom I've known for 40 or 50 years, who said, hey, you Arab, come out of retirement and help us. So I'm just grateful that the multicultural background of Tucson allows those kinds of things to happen.
And then also, you working in these communities, one of the things that stands out to me personally, looking back at your body of work, and is how much you really incorporate food systems into what it is that you're studying and the stories that you're sharing, right? So I feel like when you're working through these communities, it could have been done through so many lenses. What has really drawn you to the food system side of things? What made you decide to incorporate those two things?
Well, I think again it was my grandfather being a fruit peddler. I could see how he was hurt when the whole food chain broke down and fruit from northern Michigan or from Mexico couldn't get to his fruit truck. And I took that background from my own family, like some things you probably have taken from your own family heritage, and just incorporated it into my science. I didn't think that the diversity of seeds should just be in a laboratory or a museum, that they were selected to delight us, like agaves do in all the many mezcals. And so I wanted to make sure that they were not museum pieces stuck on a shelf, but living parts of living traditions. And that's what we're doing with the City of Gastronomy. That was the goal of Native Seed Search. That's why I cook with nearly everything I grow. I have a canning kitchen where we make shrubs and other beverages for mixologists. And I also ferment tezuino and colonche and tepache, and pretty soon fermented mezcal beverages as well. So I think to be a good scientist, you have to live it. You can't just have it as an abstraction.
One of the questions I would like to ask you, obviously we just kind of laid the foundation for where your passion for traditional knowledge and food systems comes from. and how vital the food systems are to those cultures. Me working in the agave spirits industry, the passion, the excitement for those things, for me personally, is a no-brainer. That's one of the reasons I've been so excited to have you on. But I feel like the general public's interest in these things and the momentum, the energy within the culinary world to share these, not to share these systems, to share this knowledge with consumers is a relatively new thing. And I feel like there's been a little bit of it's been a challenge. I feel like it's been an uphill battle for you guys who have been doing the work. I'm really curious what you see have been some of your biggest challenges, and maybe what you perceive as being the reasons that the things, that the underlying conditions that cause those challenges to spreading this knowledge to people, to getting them passionate about it, to getting them to have a vested interest in preserving these systems and these knowledge bases.
That's such a great question, Francisco. And I want to take it back to some of the things that Mezcal de Vago has really championed. We love Oaxaca, not just you and I, but many of the people that are in on this dialogue. And yet we know that it has incredible poverty, just like the borderlands does. And to me, there was this big irony that the people that had imparted so much traditional knowledge to me, that cared for the land so well, were just living on the fringe of what any American in cities takes for granted. I mean, we have poverty spots all throughout the United States, so I'm not saying it's exclusive to Mexico. But the question I asked myself 2 decades ago that I think still drives me is, how can we use the diversity of plant resources and the cultural knowledge about them to help the poorest of the poor get out of poverty and have decent wages and have recognition and dignity for the kinds of things they do? And I think that's the model that Mezcal de Vago and many of our other friends in the mezcal industry have independently come upon, that if we can get producers twice the value of what they might get if they just dump their mezcal into a bigger batch mixto, or just sold it into a big bottle at a local cantina without it, no recognition of what varieties that they were using or whatever, we can help get some of those people who deserve to be out of poverty. So in Tucson, at the height of the 2008 recession, when Tucson was one of the worst hit things, we said, what can we do to stimulate micro enterprises that make value-added products? And now there's over 45 micro enterprises in the Tucson area that produce 140 different kinds of food and beverage products with agaves and cacti and mesquite and tepary beans and wild chilies named chiltepines. And those things are now the margin that people have that's keeping them out of poverty. A woman that makes 300 dozen mesquite tortillas each way, largely for people who suffer from diabetes. A lot of these foods and beverages can control the obesity and diabetes epidemic that's hitting the southwestern US, Mexico. So to make sure that people have dignified livelihoods, get out of poverty, and are protected from diseases like diabetes and obesity, I think is my ultimate driving force. I don't want to lose any more friends to poverty or to disease.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that, the areas of extreme poverty are by no means the exclusive, an exclusive feature of the United States or Mexico. But I think without a doubt, one of the unifying threads is that a lot of those poorest communities are unfortunately the most heavily populated by indigenous peoples. And I think that's a common thread that stretches from the northern reaches of the continent to the southern reaches of the continent. And it's really, really a travesty. It's something that I think you and I are both passionate about. If, me, I feel like I am not completely powerless. I have some agency in the things that I do and the programs that I support, but I work very diligently, I feel like, to, that's one of the reasons I enjoy having you on, is to share, at least to increase the awareness of the contrast of the places that have the richest base of cultural knowledge are the places that economically are the poorest, and trying to bridge that gap is something that I think is incredibly vital.
Well, I think there's real social benefits to what you're saying. I mean, your work is embedded in the premise that if we pay producers what they deserve for making such great products, that it gets back in their hands, where now with three European companies getting the lion's share of the tequila industry through various brands that they bought up, that money doesn't trickle back to the jimadores the way Maestro Mezcalero gains income from a good mezcal. You guys are really working with a different business model that I think evolved under the broad notions of fair trade over the last 20 years. Oaxaca just lost its champion of fair trade, an archbishop that started the fair trade coffee movement down there. But that trickled over to the mezcal industry. And so literally, most of the mezcal producers, the maestros and maestras, are getting twice as much or three times as much as they did before all those concepts came along. And I think it's alleviating poverty, but also giving them the recognition and the support group for the good hard work that they do.
You were talking about the increase, you were talking about how many micro businesses have been started producing, selling these products. A lot of times it might just be a retiree who makes their little prickly pear jam to sell at the airport, right? And that can be one of those micro businesses, which is great. And we should support small businesses of all scales, of all types, I think, particularly, independent and small businesses. But, what are some of the mechanisms that you guys have found successful to make sure that, the most impoverished, or the most, the most marginalized communities are the ones who are benefiting from these micro businesses? Is there associations that you have seen be successful, whether you've been affiliated or worked with them or not, or are there other models that you've seen that have been particularly successful?
Well, yeah, I just had a great talk with Sosima Oliveira.
Great example, yeah.
Who's a wonderful person who takes a lot of this into account. And she said, first of all, we strike a balance between what we sell outside the community and keeping back some of our best mezcals for celebrations like Day of the Dead and Christmas and all of that. So it remains part of the culture. So, Winona LaDuke, who ran for vice president with Ralph Nader, excuse me, she does the same thing with wild rice. You make sure that it's still part of the culture. We saw a sign on the way to Sola de Vega that you've probably seen that says, mezcal isn't a fad or a fashion here, it's our tradition. And when people have that kind of pride, they make sure that the quality doesn't go down because the demand and the supply goes up. They're drinking it, so it's not faceless to them. A second thing is the kind of labeling that you all do and that many of our friends do, and that people like Pedro Jimenez teach people to sort of the literacy of labels when you go into Mezonte and in Guadalajara or Mezcaloteca in Oaxaca. You learn what the labeling means and why it matters. And then the third thing is making the connections to all what the economists call the multiplier effects of having a good local product. That the people who are doing olla de barro fermentation still rely on this one little village of Astompa for nearly all their pots or ollas that they need for the distillation. And they also like them for parts of the fermentation process too. So making sure that we're not just selling part of the product locally and sourcing locally rather than bringing in caña de azúcar or azúcar de caña from another state or locality like is happening in tequila now, but also that other businesses like the cantinas and the cantineros in them and the pottery makers and the growers are all part of those who gain benefits from this. So everyone in the food supply chain is treated with dignity. And by food, I mean, of course, food and beverage. The same principles have been pioneered in several different kinds of beverages like hard cider in the United States and mezcal in Mexico.
So what are, you have such a rich history in food and beverage and culture. I was hoping you could talk to us a little bit more. You touched on the project that you have going on right now about producing things for the bar community, et cetera. Can you kind of tell us about some of the other things that you're currently working on that you're excited about, or that other people seem to be very excited about, but just some of the projects that you have going on right now?
Yeah, let me mention just two, and if you want some more detail, I'll be happy to share it. One is a paper that 12 of us put out in September in a new science magazine called Plants, People, and Planet that shows that there's a great number of underutilized food and beverage plants that we now need to bring back into larger scale production because of climate change.
Ah.
In Arizona this year, we had 50 days over 110 degrees, the longest, hottest heat wave in history. Death Valley hit 130 degrees, one of the highest temperatures ever recorded on the planet. And most conventional crops cannot flower and fruit in that heat and give a farmer a decent living. So what's going to take their place is agriculture in Arizona and New Mexico and Sonora and California and Baja California failed due to climate change and heat waves and the heat stress on their workers. I think it's going to be agaves and prickly pears and columnar cacti, as you and I talked a little bit about and visited sites south of Guadalajara, where all those things were being grown together in what people are calling a permaculture or polyculture setting, where you have rows of agaves 5 yards apart from one another, and you grow columnar cacti like dragon fruit or pitayas in between them, with trees like mesquite and guamuchil that have edible pods on the edge of the fields that provide shade for them. And then between the agaves and the cacti, you grow corn and beans and squash or whatever else you want. So agaves are going to be a bigger part of the future of the 1/3 of the planet that's going to have desert conditions. And we need to get on that now. So we have a pilot project at Biosphere 2, another one here in Patagonia, and another one down in the Surrey country on the coast of Sonora. And we're going to have another one that we're planning now on Tumamoc Hill in the heart of Tucson. The second part is what I'm sure other speakers in your series have conversed with you about, and that's growing agaves to make sure that no bat or hummingbird species ever reaches the level of extinction. And I started on that work in the late 1970s, published one of the first papers saying that there were conservation issues with declining bats and declining agaves. And I'm happy to say that here in Patagonia, we've just received a grant of over $100,000 from the Salazar Fund at Colorado State University that's aimed at planting hundreds of thousands of agaves in Sonora and the borderlands to help the bats that pollinate Baccanora and most other agaves on the west coast of Mexico. So that project's just starting up, even though our nursery here at Borderlands Restoration Network has already been growing 5 or 6 different kinds of agaves for the last 5 years. So as Sosima said to me, for every 10 agaves that we harvest, we should be planting 20 more out in the wild or out in our fields. And there's several of the distilleries that are already doing that in Oaxaca and several more in Michoacan and Jalisco. And I think that's the wave of the future that I want to be in service to.
That's fantastic. I mean, I remember when I was looking at Borderlands Restoration Network, their website and volunteer opportunities, because I always try and, whenever I'm home, I try and see if there's anything going on or any events that I can be a part of. And I think I just missed it, but they've actually done trips for people to participate to go help plant agave, right? Or is that another?
That's right. We'll be doing those trips with a thing called the Colectiva Sonorense in Hermosillo, 2 really on fire women, Leah and Valeria at University of Sonora, that have a new nonprofit. And most of those plantings will be on ranches where Baccanora is produced. And then we have right below our house at the Borderlands Nursery that does 50,000 plants in a good year, 30,000 in the tough year, to be planted out in the landscape of all kinds of species. They're also doing it for firewood species that the mezcaleros need in places like Sola de Vega, not just restricting what they're planting to the agaves alone, but the fuel species that are needed that are in decline in some of the communities as well. So, here at my place, I grow about 15 species of agave, about 25 varieties. And then I have another 120 varieties of heirloom fruit trees. And that's what keeps me off the street. And as I get older, because of arthritis and things, I think locally produced beverages, not just local food, is high on my agenda.
So we only have a few more minutes left. I did want to ask you about, something from previously in your career. Typically, I try and end with what people are working on currently, but I feel like I would be a little bit remiss if I didn't just ask about your experience working on the tequila book, which I mentioned at the beginning was kind of one of the first books that really kind of framed my vision and my approach to learning about these spirits, talking about these spirits, selling these spirits, just sharing knowledge with people about these spirits. How was that project? What was that like working on? How did you guys do research for that? What was really how did you envision the goal for that project being?
Well, thank you for asking about that. That book's about 20 years old now, but it goes back to a 40-year-old friendship with this brilliant pioneer among women in the tequila industry, Ana Valenzuela Zapata, who's like my baby sister. We were both mentored by Dr. Gentry, and when she first came up to the United States to talk about her work in the tequila industry, I was her translator and chauffeur. So we've maintained a friendship like brother and sister for 4 decades. And we wanted to tell Americans what had slipped by most of them, that the tequila industry diverged from the other mezcal industries. It was once called Vino Mezcal de Tequila, as you and I heard Carlos Camarena and other people talk eloquently about, and that it had 8 different kinds of agaves in the fields. And now people are coming back to that with the ancestral tequilas. But at the same time, we wanted to put out a warning, a clarion cry, like Paul Revere, that there was danger, there were risks in the tequila industry that needed to be taken seriously. And that was monoculture, that it's the most genetically uniform crop in the world, competing only with sugarcane for that dubious honor. And that not only is it one clone of one variety on 200,000 plus acres, but it's also grown in monoculture. You don't see corn and beans between the rows like you did when I was a kid. It's also one of the only agaves that's harvested before it's mature, which is for me, it's a kind of plant infanticide, that they're harvesting agaves at 2.5 years of age before they develop their chemical defenses and their flavor as mature plants. So the people who do that just don't even have humidors harvest the pinas. They're coming in with a backhoe, yanking them out of the ground, taking them to diffusers and autoclaves where the sugars are blasted out of them with no flavor or aroma. And then after the sugars are fermented in columnar stills, flavorants and colorants are added back to them. And we saw that whole industry was on the precipice of an epidemic as severe as COVID or AIDS. In fact, the Mexicans called it the SIDA or AIDS of the tequila. And it was the scientific nickname for it is the tristeza y muerte epidemic of bacterias and viruses in a cocktail that wiped out about 80 distilleries in a matter of 3 years because there was no product. And so, as Carlos Camarena said, we hoped that the mezcal industry could learn from the grave mistakes and miscalculations that the tequila industry had made. And I just have to say that so many of our friends and colleagues and your professional team have all been involved in doing it right this time, rather than having mezcals follow tequila down a road that has a precipice or cliff at the end of it. And I think that's unfortunately what's happened to tequila. It's lost its soul, but it's also lost its flavor. And that has not happened to the mezcal producers that we know yet.
Yeah, I do apologize because when I had mentioned the book, I just, I held it up. I did not mention Dr. Valenzuela, who I think is one of the preeminent scholars in agave that is around currently. Unfortunately, since I started traveling to Mexico, she has now moved to Europe, so I have not had the opportunity to interact with her on a personal level. But she does have her own podcast, Agave Cultura podcast. So if you have the ear for Spanish, I highly encourage you to go seek those out. She is very prolific with the number that she's putting out, and I think it's just a really incredible resource for people to hear from some really fascinating voices in the agave and agave spirit space. So please go check that out. It's Agave Cultura is the name of the podcast, and I can't encourage you guys enough to go research those and listen to them.
I just have to say quickly, I know we're out of time, but
that's okay.
She and I really prophesized that disease epidemic, and the tequila industry sort of marginalized her because they thought she was bringing bad news, and she was trying to keep them healthy. And I think that's why she had to go to work in Europe, where people were much more attentive to these messages. And the good people in the tequila industry, of course, took heed of our message. And so there has been some positive change. I'm not anti-tequila at all.
No, and I think, that's one of the things that we're really lucky about, is that we get to run in the circles of people who are really have I think, stood on the shoulders of you giants to a certain extent from an academic perspective, even though being giants in their own right in the production side of things. But, lucky enough to have Tomas on and get to interact so much with Carlos through my own work with Tequila Ocho. Had Sophie on a few weeks ago.
Right.
and was lucky, get to interact with David Suro so much, who has become such a guardian of the culture and has such a high respect for
That's
both
right.
you and Professor Valenzuela. And, like I said, have even, very much shaped my own view on how I message about these spirits. So I hope that I am holding true to the spirit of what you and all of us that are kind of my generation are holding true to the spirit of what you guys are kind of setting forth for the industry, and hoping the direction that we can at least not drive the ship completely, but at least kind of counterbalance the other side of things to a certain extent.
That's right. Well, thank you so much for this time with you and your friends, and blessings for everything you do, and hope to see you soon personally.
Oh, Gary, you're the best guest ever, man. You take me you take me directly to the outro, and I don't even have to do it. So thank you so much to everybody. Please take care of yourself down there. Hopefully I will be in Arizona sooner rather than later. But whenever I am, I will be sure that we get to dine together from a safe distance, my friend.
And I have a new book out for you that I'll give you when we see each other in print, about the anthology of desert writing from Mexico and U.S. that I think you'll see as a good travel friend. So take care.
Thank you, bud. And for those that just saw that, we will be sure and post the book through our Instagram story. So take care, everyone. Bye-bye.